Hello, and welcome to another video. We're talking about the state of PvP a little bit in this, and not really a commentary, but rather you get to see some footage in the background if you care about it. Just an average random game that I usually get on engineering. Nothing special for the most part. This is one of the earlier ones before I was changing my talents and figuring out exactly what I like. So there are definitely some changes that I've made to engineering. So this is definitely not necessarily what I use right now, but what I was learning with initially, which I expect has been pretty fun to mess around and learn on. While it has good burst, its sustain is also not terrible, but really all my games, I've not had a situation where I can just cast on people, let alone a situation where people survive long enough to really even do more than just a burst window on somebody. Which is really disappointing. I try to get a game where people don't die instantly, but I just can't. I just can't get one. There's just not enough healers in the game anymore. So anyway, going into the state of PvP, which that does have some relevance to it. There's a lot of point of failures, so I want to point out all the point of failures first before we even get into this, because there's a lot of things that actually go into PvP that a lot of people just don't seem to even care about or even think about or even consider it. So going into first point of failure is gear. Gear is incredibly important, and everybody that says gear isn't important or doesn't really that matter, they're straight up lying to you, and they are, I wouldn't say ignorant, but I would definitely have to say not educated on the topic at all. As long as you have gear, like let's say you have 332 and you have augments, that's important. Optimal stats, not necessarily always required, but it is nice to have because it allows you to do more damage in a meta where damage is so important. You can obviously see how that spirals in importance and how impactful you can actually be. But giving an example, let's say you're in 320 or 324 or whatever the minimum green gear that you get from Conquest is. You don't have any augments because you're new and you can't afford it yet. If you go into PvP, chances are you probably don't have all your companion buffs, but if you do, that's great. It's a good step forward. But chances are you probably don't have all the class buffs. And if you don't have all the class buffs, that's a problem, especially if you're not a sorcerer, because if you don't have the sorcerer buff, you miss out on having 10% elemental damage reduction, which does matter in some cases because there are some elemental damage dealers. For example, engineering is one of them, and pyro is another one. And there's some other abilities that also do elemental damage. If knowing that, you also have the 5% endurance buff from power tech, and then just basically raw damage from the other two. 5% crit is nothing to laugh about. It's very important. And you will feel like you hit like a wet noodle without it. So missing your buffs is a huge problem, and even if you do have all the stories, sometimes you can miss your buffs, and missing buffs just naturally puts you at a disadvantage that a lot of people don't think about. Even in this video right now, you can see me fighting somebody that doesn't have all their buffs. The Slinger does have all his buffs, but the Sage doesn't. This inherently puts the Sage at a disadvantage against me at all times. Then, of course, with augments, not getting a bolster for augments is probably the worst thing that's ever happened in Star Wars, I would say. I think even at 1.0, we still had a bolster for augments, I think. And not having these slots filled, actually no, 2.0 might have also had the same issue too. I think about it, but you get the point. Without augments, the stat loss that you have is so drastic that you miss about 50,000 HP. That's a lot. That's like an extra ability. Not to mention most of those stats are secondary stats that increase your damage. So you end up in another situation where you're, again, put at a disadvantage against other people that probably don't have this disadvantage. Now that we have, I guess, gear out of the way, optimizing your stats, again, is important, but at least getting the gear check first is definitely more important. Now, the second point of failure is talents. Not only do you have to get gear, and, if you want to optimize it, which you should, because it does make a difference, you have talents that you can pick. You can end up picking a dead talent. You could end up picking a talent that you didn't think anything about, or you forgot to change it, or you pick talents that sound good but aren't actually good. This whole play your own way, I enjoy that, but there's not enough meta choices, I guess you could say, to really justify all the choices that we do. Some of the choices are very bad. So, for example, let's say defensives. The fact that you can pick a defensive or not, for example, like trauma regulators for mercenary. If you choose not to take some of your more important defensives that allow you to survive, like your basic survivability, you are screwing yourself. And unless you know to like change that talent and actually take it, you don't really know what you're missing out on, especially if you're new to the game, you don't look up guides. Or if you do look up guides and you're like, oh, it's 3 months old or 6 months old or a year old, oh, it's outdated. Well, first, it's not outdated. And second, you really just don't know what you're missing out on. A lot of people do consider a couple months old to 6 months to a year to be outdated for guides. And I'm starting to realize that, and that's really sad because Star Wars doesn't get that many updates. Sometimes even like year-old guides are still relevant. Even my guide from last expansion for Power Attack is still relatively important to this day. It still teaches you a lot of things because a lot of the things are still the same. And then going into, again, talents, we have some dead choices. And I don't mean like having to pick your defenses or anything like that. We have some choices on pretty much every single spec in the game that it's just not worth taking. If there was a statistic for how many people take like XYZ talent, it would be probably dramatically high for certain abilities that just never get taken. That's what I'm talking about. There are some abilities that are just really bad, and maybe like sub 5% of the population take it, and they probably don't even know what it does or really care or even put any thought into it. Now, sometimes they do have niche uses, so I'm not saying like to prune them, but there are definitely some choices that maybe just shouldn't be choices, and or things that are like so drastically important, like trauma regulators, maybe shouldn't be a choice because it's like your basic survivability, kind of like Undying Rage, stuff like that. When you take other things, it's a little bit different. I don't think the choice between like choke mad dash is bad, but I think having to choose Undying Rage I think is a little silly, but that's just one example of many. There's other things that are obviously a problem. So, for example, assassins lost force speed of Zorb, and they are paper. And if they want to take reduced cooldown on their force speed for basic mobility, because since they're already paper, you might as well have a good, mobility. You have to give up Shroud Out to have basic mobility. How is that fair? A class that already doesn't have good survivability has to give up something for basic mobility. It's just, it doesn't feel good. It's not fun. And talents are just not made equally. Pruning was not done equally. So when you pick a bad choice, it impacts on top of the getting issue and adds another point of failure. Now, going into another point of failure is the fact that there's a lot of people that probably don't bother to learn the defensives, let alone use medbacks and Warzone journals. The game kind of just gives them to you, and you can read it, and you can see what they do. And they only work in Warzone, so if they're reading outside of a Warzone, they'll probably think, oh, that's cool, whatever. I'll save those for when I really need them. Well, the thing is that you have so many of them, and you're supposed to use them all the time. It's part of pretty much PvP in a whole. One is an extra defensive, and the other one is relatively big hill. And not using these puts you at another disadvantage. People that don't use these don't take that much damage and don't survive very well, and generally are easy to focus down pretty much all the time. There's a big difference between somebody popping Warzone journal and not. I know there's a lot of people that never use the red Warzone journal, like ever, and they should really stop doing that. Just hit it. Best way to put it into perspective is like, if you ever played Bounty Hunter Energy Shield, it's not as strong as Energy Shield, but it's almost as strong as Energy Shield. Think of it that way, and hopefully you'll start using it more. It'll help your survivability tremendously, and it'll typically allow you to take more damage overall. It's also the one or the two, as you can see in this video, that you can use multiple times regardless of combat is not percent, as medvac does require combat to reset. That's another huge thing that a lot of people just seem to ignore. They don't even keybind it, they click it, and it's definitely something that you should consider. And as part of that point of failure, I also want to include like just defensive management, basically. We'll just call this defensive management. A lot of people, again, don't know their defenses, don't take some of their defenses like trauma regulators. It's really bad. There are some times that you could probably get away without taking trauma regulators, but most of the time, most of these players that I'm pointing out definitely should, and it's very important. So going into defensive management, there are a couple ways that you want to manage your defenses. Usually you want to use your lowest cooldown ones first, with exception of like Endure Pain, because Endure Pain can be a double-edged sword. It's the only double-edged sword still in the game. Then you have defenses that are damage reduction or defense chance. So for example, Saber Ward, not very impactful at mitigating damage like completely. Like, let's say Pyro Yod giving you 20% damage reduction, and there's no armor pen specs in the game, so you're getting a lot of damage reduction, being very tanky. Or Energy Shield, getting you vault QR. It's not like that. If somebody's doing white damage, you have a chance to miss, so you completely negate the damage, and then for yellow damage, you absorb 25% of the yellow damage that's incoming towards you. Now, at most, that defensive is not great, and it's a 3-minute cooldown. Against white damage, usually most of the white damage in the game is not meta. It's pretty useful. So that's one thing that you have to learn about just Saber Ward, for example. Deflection, it's also the same way, except for it doesn't have yellow absorb. Learning basically your defensives and when you should use them is really important. And Saber Ward and deflection usage is something that a lot of people just have no idea about at all. And if you get CC'd, your defense chance goes to 0, so you really don't want to get CC'd while you have that ability up, because then it kind of negates the entire usage of it. However, the 25% yellow absorb still works while you're stunned, at least for the Juggernaut version. And I guess the Warrior version, because it's for Marauder too. But deflection doesn't do that. But going into damage reduction, the way you want to use damage reduction is before you start taking damage, or as you're taking damage. You want to pop damage reduction as you're taking damage and knowing that they're going to commit to you. So you need to use damage reduction at a high percentage of health. If you're using at a low percentage of health and you don't have any incoming healing, that damage reduction is completely useless. And I don't know how to express that more. Power Tech, for example, if any of you guys have a hard time playing Power Tech, it's probably because you're not using your defenses correctly and you're not using them aggressively. You can't sit on them and like, oh, I'm low, now I pop a defensive. No, it's damage reduction, so you use it to mitigate damage. You don't use it to save yourself at low health. It's just not how it's designed. Some other classes are like that. Usually most of the range ones are kind of sometimes like that, not always. It's kind of like how trauma regulator is for Energy Shield on Mercenaries. It's best example. Very similar in playstyle. And then I would say probably the last point of failure is just miscellaneous, right? So you've got people that are lagging, you got people that are dissing you, you got people that are only there for objectives, you got people that are only there for conquest, you got people that only care about winning, or people that are just there to duel, or there's pre-mades. Generally bad matchmaking. There is a variety of reasons that somebody might not do what you expect them to do, so there's definitely no reason to get mad at them at all. There's so many reasons why somebody wouldn't do or couldn't do what you expect them to do, and their gap in experience compared to you or somebody else may be a lot bigger than what you think, or it could be a lot smaller and they just choose to do something else. At the end of the day, PvP is pretty much only casual. There's nothing serious about PvP anymore, and that's pretty much the way it seems that they want it to be. And I've come to accept that. A lot of objective players seemingly have not come to accept that. I understand that winning is really important for most people, but there's more to it than winning. You can't win every single game, so there's no reason to create your entire team for the entirety of the war zone, contributing 0 to the match, while they're probably contributing a lot more than you are. One thing to take away from this is that, again, there's so many issues right now. And if nothing changes, it's just going to decline endlessly